Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for coming to this press conference. So we'll start right on. So thank you. My name is David Obura. I'm Director of Cordia East Africa, and I'm on the Earth Commission. And we've called this press conference together to update or send out some news on a letter for scientists that we have developed. My co-leads of this letter, they initiated was really E.J. Milner-Gulland of Oxford University and Mike Barrett, the Chief Scientists and Conservation Director at WWF UK. And on the panel, we have Tanya Steele, the CEO of WWF UK, and Henry Grubb of Imperial College in the UK, who's part of the Nature Positive Universities Coalition. So we'll all participate in this statement. So I'll start off by reading out the press statement that we can provide to you online as well through some links. So we're at the UN Biodiversity Conference, or COP15, taking place in Montreal, Canada, with delegates from 196 countries negotiating a new post-2020 global biodiversity framework to attempt to halt the rapid destruction of species worldwide. The vision is to ensure that biodiversity is valued. The vision is to ensure that biodiversity is valued, protected, and restored by 2050. A key part of the framework will be a set of agreed interim targets for 2030 to ensure this vision can be achieved. Researchers, conservationists, and the public across the world are calling for this agreement to include ambitious goals to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity and put nature on a path to recovery by 2030. In other words, rather than simply stopping the further decline in species and habitats, we need to achieve a state where the amount of biodiversity worldwide is actually increasing. We call for COP15 negotiators to set ambitious targets for 2030 to focus, motivate, and finance actions to start reversing biodiversity loss immediately, to include time-bound targets for key drivers of biodiversity loss to be reduced to sustainable levels, and third, achieving this will require wealthy countries and sectors of society to rapidly reduce the impact of their consumption. These actions are most recently highlighted in a scientific article published in the journal One Earth, released on 5th December 2022, as COP15 was ramping up, entitled Achieving a Nature and People Positive Future. This article builds on a long tradition of research stretching back 50 years and more, including the massive efforts recently of thousands of scientists working through the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. However, the clear and urgent advice of scientists that ambitious action to address the biodiversity crisis is required now has still not been fully taken up in global policy. Now, many are questioning whether halting and starting to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 is realistic and achievable, but we argue that there is no time to lose in initiating this reversal. If we don't, we again pass the increasing burden to our children and future generations. Signatories to this letter represent a global cross-section, as of an hour ago, of over 500 biodiversity scientists and other researchers from more than 50 countries, and this number is growing. We urge negotiators of the Global Biodiversity Framework to resist all pressures to weaken its ambition. We have prepared and signed a statement urging that the 2030 deadline is not abandoned in the COP15 negotiations and that ambitious quantitative targets on reversing biodiversity decline and reducing pressures are retained. Science tells us now with certainty that ambitious targets are necessary to put nature on a path to recovery, to avert the loss of functionality of our Earth systems and severe impacts on humanity. We know that full recovery of biodiversity will take many decades, but we argue that removing the need for the targets and actions within the Global Biodiversity Framework to be time-bound and ambitious would be deeply counterproductive. To do so will give cover to the many vested interests lobbying to delay meaningful action, doom biodiversity to further decades of degradation and loss, exacerbate poverty and inequity, and undermine our capacity to withstand and adapt to rapid environmental change. Instead, it is vital that the framework includes ambitious interim targets for 2030 that prompt and require immediate action, focused on places where biodiverse ecosystems are most at risk, where people are most reliant on nature for their well-being and livelihoods, and on those parts of society where the most profound changes must be made. The group emphasizes the need to pay attention to the disproportionately harmful consumption of wealthy nations and actors, and to the rights and priorities of disadvantaged groups. Critically, this means that wealthy nations and actors need urgently and rapidly to reduce the impacts of their consumption rather than passing the costs of nature recovery on to less wealthy nations where the biodiversity predominantly remains and to future generations globally. The statement also calls for immediate action in phasing out unsustainable supply chains. As COP15 is coming to a conclusion after 3 years of negotiation on the global biodiversity framework, many fear that a narrow focus on national ambitions and vested interests will produce a weak framework that will fail to meet the responsibilities we currently face. We call on researchers from around the world to sign on to our call for ambitious commitments by all our countries and by all societal actors to play their part in assuring success. A strong, ambitious framework of 2030 targets and 2050 goals will not guarantee success, but it is a necessary precondition. Please visit the URLs that we provide at the head of this statement to read the call for researchers to sign it and to share among your networks. Thank you. With that, I'll hand over to Tanya Steele.
Henry, thank you. To add my own comments and that of WWF UK, the parties to COP15 must commit to halting and starting to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. We know that without an ambitious mission to inspire the public and leverage public support, nothing happens. But of course, this mission should be achievable. That's why this coalition of scientists, 500 from over 50 countries and growing, their message is clear. This can be done and it must be done. The science tells us we can halt and reverse biodiversity loss. This doesn't mean we can recreate the past just as it was in the future, but it does mean that we can ensure that ecosystems around the world can be restored to health, and anything less is unforgivable for future generations. It's clear that restoring nature will take decades, but halting its loss will not. It won't be easy, and every possible lever needs to be pulled. That means going beyond, far beyond conservation and addressing the drivers of biodiversity loss. This means transforming all systems from food, production, consumption, through to our economic systems. Stopping the destruction of nature is a choice, and a choice that must be made by leaders at Montreal in COP15. Diluting or delaying nature targets would be deeply counterproductive. To do so would doom biodiversity to further decades of destruction, exacerbate global poverty and inequality, and undermine our ability to cope with climate change. Nature loss drives over a fifth of all climate emissions. This COP has already been delayed by 2 long years, and if we can't agree a deal now, we miss the very best chance this decade to start to reverse nature's decline before tipping points are triggered. That is the point when reversing the devastating damage humans have caused to our planet becomes irreversible. The sooner we act, the sooner we begin on the pathway to recovery. The ever-growing drumbeat from the scientific community calling the alarm for nature tells us that conservation, no matter how well financed, cannot solve the nature crisis alone. The time is now to listen to the science, which is giving us a clear and unified message. Halting and reversing biodiversity loss is achievable, but only by addressing the drivers of loss. The consumption of wealthy nations is disproportionately harmful to the rights and priorities of disadvantaged groups and nations, particularly regarding unsustainably produced commodities, primarily food. Wealthy nations, having depleted our own biodiversity, are now offshoring our loss. This is our environmental footprint. This needs to stop, and nature-rich countries in the developing world need to receive adequate support and means to implement the actions to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. That means financial resources, as well as capacity building, tech transfer, enabling national policies and strategies, and importantly, for this to be a co-collaboration exercise. So the concept of bending the curve must not be used as an excuse to try and solve the nature crisis by placing the burden on less wealthy, but still relatively biodiverse nations. The authors of the original Bending the Curve concept, in fact, meant quite the opposite, that the burden of action must be on those nations that have driven and still today drive global biodiversity loss. If this COP is to truly change the game, then at its heart must be a commitment to tackle the drivers of loss, including a clear target to tackle environmental footprint. We simply can't keep playing for time. In summary, we need a 2030 target to drive action. The scientific community is ringing the alarm for nature. This is about what must happen, not what's politically convenient. With an inspiring mission, a strong guidance structure, and checks and balances to ensure targets are delivered, this deal has every chance of success. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. I'd just like to speak a little bit more about what universities specifically are doing on this topic. Scientists like us are individuals, but we're part of institutions, and together, our sector, higher education, has a massive biodiversity footprint. From the food that we eat on campuses, to the land and our buildings, paper, lab equipment, this all adds up, and we recognise this all needs to be dealt with at an institutional level. But our universities and scientists also do a lot of good. Our research and education projects have worldwide saved and restored a lot of biodiversity across the globe. Last week, the University of Oxford and the United Nations Environment Programme, supported by the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, launched the Nature Positive Universities Initiative here at COP15. And 120 universities from 48 different countries have made the pledge to commit themselves to account their biodiversity impact baseline, set specific and appropriate targets to mitigate that, and undertake actions until they can account for and mitigate all of their impact some point in the future. They must report transparently and publicly so as to be able to guide our community, but also to inform the public exactly what it is they are doing to deal with that biodiversity impact. And the initiative is based around the conservation hierarchy of actions, which states that the first and foremost, you must refrain and reduce. Our member universities have committed to addressing their drivers of biodiversity loss and making sure they prevent loss before anything else. We've just launched, and so we are looking for new members to commit and join. Students, staff, and institutions can all sign up to Nature Positive Universities. What this is showing is that the higher education sector is starting to make its commitment to halting and reversing biodiversity loss in recognition that we all have a part to play. And this action must be matched by the parties at COP15 this week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you, Tanya. I think just to finish off our statements here, I'll just state so people hear it, that we've put this call up online. We've put it on a short URL from bit.ly. So at bit.ly, bend the curve 2030, any scientist around the world or researcher can have a look at that, read the statement, and sign up to this sheet. And we'd like your signatures as soon as you can do it, so we can really show the consensus that we have around the world, across all countries, on this cause. So thank you. So I think now we're ready for questions. If there's questions from any press. No?
Great.
Okay, thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.